Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the propaganda, the hysterical anti-white, anti-colonial, anti-British propaganda that's put about by primarily Indian nationalists and agitators and stirrers and sundry propagandists about the 1943 famine in northeast India in the province of Bengal, which the wider area straddles what today is Bangladesh, and again a part of northeast India in what's called the Bay of Bengal. Now, I'd just like to go over the if you like the history of the region, and but before I do that, the Indian nationalists and the propagandists generally, and there's a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon because it's a good anti-colonial, anti-white, anti-British story here, is that somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 million Indians in that region supposedly died as a result of the famine. The nationalists argue, the propagandists argue that this was effortlessly avoidable, but the famine was made to happen purposefully, willfully by evil white people, and Winston Churchill, is considered to be one of the prime movers in this evil and this wickedness. Now, I've looked at a number of interviews that these nationalist propagandists do, whether it's on Indian nationalist television or even in the West, and they're invited into universities to do talks and into NGOs and so on to whip up anti-white sentiment. And they tell the most terrible bunch of lies, and there's just no pushback. No one pushes back against any of the assertions. They sit there quietly and nod along while these lies just come cascading out. And this has emboldened these activists and propagandists to make the lies even bigger and the stories taller and so on. So it's morphed from a fairly cautious anti-white, anti-British, anti-colonial message to now it fairly bellows out that all whites are evil, colonialism, Nazis, fascists, and Churchill is really Hitler, and so on and so forth. So let's just examine this and have a look at India more broadly and the famine, the supposed famine. Now, when the British first started arriving in India, this is when they just had coastal trading posts. This is before they started moving inland, and there's reasons for that, but they had trading posts around the coast of India, including what was then called Calcutta, and which was later on became really the centre of British operations in the area, but or British trading primarily, if not exclusively. But the British at the time noted how frequent famines were in India and how the upper classes cared not one jot for the poor peasants who were ruthlessly parasited upon by the upper castes, and particularly the Brahmins that lived the lives of demigods. It was in the caste system, the social structure, if you like, of India. It was considered to be the lot of the peasants that they would die like flies whenever there was an extreme weather event, like the flooding or heavy rains or drought or whatever it might be, but or plagues and pestilence and so on. That was the lot of these peasants, and they would die by the million, and did. And the British were as indeed were the French. The British were surprised about how uncaring the social elites, the Brahmins, were about the plight of the people at the bottom of the heap, the untouchables as they were called. And even though they were dying by the millions, the Brahmins just didn't care. There was just a shoulder shrug of, well, that's how it is. What are we supposed to do? Well, if there's fewer peasants there to extract, taxes from, we'll just have to double the tax for the ones that are left. And the Brahmins were like, well, that's how it is. the Brahmins were entitled to their share of things, and they would just keep on extorting it, increase the extortion to take from the peasant masses, who again would die like flies. Now, in the area around Calcutta, you get the Ganges River and all that, but it's a river, a flood plain, if you like, and so when the water comes down from the mountains, it's quite rich, and because the soil's so rich, it's wonderful for growing food. So peasants, will come into the area to take even a smallish plot of land, because the soil's so rich and the productive yield in agricultural products is so good. So anyway, this area then is, because it's a floodplain, is constantly prone to major events, well, floods primarily. But if the rains don't come, and like the Nile River, actually, if the rains don't come, and if it doesn't sort of have at least some extent of flood, then the rich soil nutrients don't come along, and so the crop yield is much reduced, and that causes mass famine and starvation, because the people, just every square inch of land has got a peasant on it trying to grow something. So the slightest flood, the slightest weather event, anything, more rain, too much rain, not enough rain, all of this sort of stuff, and mass famines. Now, because they're packed in so tight, there's obviously hygiene issues. There's no sewerage and these sorts of things. So as soon as there's a weather event of any sort, really, there's plagues and all sorts of health issues break out. And again, given these people are already on a minimal diet, they're very susceptible to diseases, and so they die. So at any given year in this wider Bengal, at any given year, there's 1 million people are dying. And I just want to sort of highlight that the life expectancy when the British arrived was less than 30 years old. So we're not talking about middle-class people in their nice brick houses, driving their cars and this. We're not talking about it. We're talking, absolutely dirt poor peasants living on the margin, like razor edge of a margin, and that's how it's been for many hundreds, if not thousands, of years before the British turned up, or any Western people saw it. So that's the status. Every year in that area, assuming everything is perfect, there's just the right amount of rain, just the right. All the doors are still 1 million people plus are going to die from what would otherwise in a middle class modern white country be avoidable. But remember, we're talking here, the first mass famine that the British saw was in the 1600s, and then there was another one, I think, in the 1760s. And if you look at the amount of the population at the time and the amount of people that died in those famines, that was much worse than the famine that the 1943 famine that the British are particularly blamed for by the propagandists. So we need to put that in perspective. We're not talking a place where nobody died and suddenly millions of people died. Now, in the numbers that are supposed to have died in the 1943 famine, as with all propaganda, the accurate numbers are hard to come by. The low-end estimates are around 1.5 million. The high-end estimates are around 3.5 million people died. Now, 1 million people are going to die anyway. We're talking dirt poor peasants that the upper caste Indians don't give a fuck about, and they die like flies, and that's their lot. They did something bad in their last life, so that they're being punished in this life for the evils they may have. That's the sort of if you like, the attitude that the Brahmin and the upper caste Indians had. They didn't give a shit, and these people deserved it anyway. So the idea they run around today saying, "Well, look at all those people who died, isn't it terrible?" They didn't give a shit back in the day, whether it's in the 1700s, 1600s, or indeed in the 1940s. Now, the lot of the peasants had improved quite considerably since the British arrived. So the idea that the peasants are worse off is nonsense. Now, there's things that the British had put in place, like roads and rail and ports, deep water ports, and various things that hadn't existed previously, which made the area generally more prosperous. This is Bengal, made the area more prosperous. So more and more peasants were moving in. Should the British have stopped these peasants from moving? Maybe, but so that it's even more populous, as in more densely populated than it's ever been. So the situation is already set up for a major disaster here. So there's more people than there's ever been in that Bengal area. And again, it's a rich floodplain. So people go because of now the transport mechanisms such as rail and the deep water ports are there, and modern day shipping and so on. Then the area was attracting more peasants than it ever had done. Also, a lot of the peasants wanted to be in British areas of control because the taxation was less arbitrary. If they were in areas where there was Indians in control, the taxation became very arbitrary. If the local Brahmin goons just wanted more money so they could piss it up against the wall, they would just arbitrarily increase the taxation. All these things, of course, are very, very neatly avoided by the propagandists. It's all those bad, evil whiteys, it's all them. They did it. Now, so what was happening in the 1940s? Well, just in the wider scheme of things, the Indian nationalists at the time were quite active in wanting Indian independence, and they had no clear plan they just wanted the British out. And people like Gandhi and the guys around him, they just accepted that India could very, very likely collapse into civil war if the British left, because India wasn't a nation when the British turned up. The British have unified the various provinces of India into, more or less a sort of the basis of a nation state, and it wasn't that previously. So the idea of a national language, English, that hadn't existed, the Indian languages and dialects are quite far apart. So the Indians now had a national language, national rail network, national legal framework, national political framework, all bequeathed by the British, but it gave them then a sense of national purpose that hadn't existed hitherto. So there was a lot of agitation by the Indian nationalists, the Indian Congress, were wanting to have independence. But as even Gandhi would say, well, let's just get the British out. It's going to be a civil war. Who cares? That'll just sort things out. Now, Gandhi at this stage was sort of about 70. And whereas 20 years ago, he'd seen that he would have he would be immortalized by history, and he saw that slipping away. So he at this age, he looked at the situation and thought, holy crap, I may die before India gets independence, and thus my godlike status and immortality may not be enshrined in history forever. So he was kind of pretty keen to move things along. Now, in 1943, the British were hard pressed by the war, so there was a desperate shortage of shipping, and the Japanese were coming in through Burma. The Japanese army were coming in through Burma. The British were quite reasonably concerned that they would come in and invade India and cut off the British in India there. So that was an area of concern. The British just simply didn't have the military resources to really effectively fight the Japanese. The Indians had set up a separate army that was fighting with the Japanese. So that created much anxiety in the jitters. Not that many Indians from the British, Indians employed in the British Army defected, but enough did to have the British authorities wringing their hands and chewing their fingernails and so on. Now, in 1942-43, there was a major flooding in the area. So, hundreds of thousands of people were killed just by that. Then there was the sanitation issues, and also then there was a big crop failure. Now, there wasn't a shortage of crops or food in India, but the areas that were unaffected by the droughts and or the floods or the extreme weather events, those areas were semi-autonomous zones controlled by Indians, and the Indians didn't want to. Why should we, the Brahmins that controlled it? Why should we give all that food to the untouchables? They're the low-end peasants. They're supposed to die anyway. That's their lot in life. Why the fuck should we give? So there was a lot of that going on as well. Something that the propagandists and nationalists quite conveniently ignore. There was the shortage of shipping, so there was possibility of moving food around by ship, but there was shortage of these ships. A serious shortage of these ships. It's wartime, for goodness sakes. There was a shortage of these ships, and there was Japanese naval activity and submarines in the area, which made shipping rather hazardous anyway. Japanese aircraft, Japanese controlled the air, certainly around the southern part of the Bay of Bengal. So there was a lot of things getting in the way. Now, on top of this, saboteurs in India, Indian nationalist saboteurs, kept sabotaging things like telegraph lines, telephone lines, railway, rail tracks were being torn up or blown up. Carriages and engine locomotives were being sabotaged, and all these sorts of things were going on at the same time. So now, on top of this, the traders, the agricultural traders around that area, the wider area of Bengal, they sort of tried to play a gambit that they would hoard grain and rice and whatever else they could lay their hands on, in the hope that if they hoarded it, they would artificially pump up the price. The British government would then pay this extortionate price for the grain in order to release the food. And so these traders and Brahmins would make windfall profits out of this. That didn't happen, and a lot of that grain, because it was badly stored and perished, or was eaten by rice or something, eaten by rats and mice and so on. So the whole thing was you could say it was ineffectively managed, and I think it was. But given that there was a large Japanese army nearby, there was the warfare, the shortage of the Indian nationalists harassing the rail networks and communications networks, the large number of people that were in that area that had come in, the floods and so on, that it was an absolutely perfect storm for large numbers of people, these peasants, to die, which indeed they did. Now, whether it was now remember, when you're looking at these numbers, 1 million would have died anyway, even in perfect conditions. That's how it was in India. That's not good or bad or a judgment. That's how it was, and it was fully acceptable to the Indian upper classes, and always had been. The British had improved the situation for the peasants, but not to the extent that they were all living middle class lifestyles in nice brick homes and so on. I mean, that's not how it was. Bear in mind that when the Europeans turned up, the first turned up in India, the Indian sort of economy was 1/6 as productive as the European economy, which gives you an idea. There was, even this is in the pre-industrial age, there was this chasm of difference between productivity in Europe and productivity in India. Anyway, so when the flood occurred, major flooding, which caused major disruption to agricultural production, obviously, but also distribution. If you can't use the river system to move things around, due to the flooding, then or it's severely impeded, then that simply adds to the whole thing. Then when you've got that many people living in such a small area, tens of millions. Even today, close to 100 million people live just in that area there. So you're looking at, given the no sewage and the poor sanitation, the drinking water, it's all affected, and so people are dying in large numbers from plague. This is after the malnutrition or following the malnutrition. So if 1 million people are dying anyway in perfect conditions, the deaths are probably around 2.5 million in reality. Now, how many of those were as a direct result of the famine or of the follow-on diseases, the plagues that occurred? That's harder to separate one from the other. Given the all the issues and all the input issues around this, to say that it was some sort of premeditated act of malice by the British is absurd, absolutely absurd. There's some argument where you could say that, given there was possible cases of negligence, but the British have no more responsibility for this than did the Brahmins and did the Indian grain traders and so on that were hoarding, and the nationalist activists that were disrupting the rail network, or the other Indian states, semi-autonomous Indian states, that refused to send relief supplies to the area, or drag their feet, or made extortionate demands on price. And these are, why don't they equally take blame, if not more blame? There were food resources that were 100 miles away that just couldn't get into the area in time. And a lot of that, if not most of it, was due to foot dragging and obfuscation by the local Brahmin Indian traders and business people and financiers and so on. So this was clearly not so the idea that Churchill was uniquely instrumental in this is just because he's a big name, big white name, and they just want to use that as to wave around. But the reality is that there was no wicked, evil British plot to kill Indians. That's absolute and utter and total crap. But it's something that the propagandists used to really quite good effect in terms of pushing their bullshit to quite good effect. You've been fantastic today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.